Well, today I want to talk a little bit about some tools, and I thought a great way to introduce you to some of the tools and techniques that I use was to take an idea from one of the emails that was sent in. And the person emailed requesting that I demonstrate how to produce fur on an animal. So I thought, well, that's great. What I'll do is actually show you several different things that are like the hair that you would be using in different animals. One is the kind of skin of a reptile or a mammal, the kind of leathery skin that you would find on perhaps a rhino in a mammal or an elephant, but in a reptile you might find on a large monitor. It doesn't have the scaling that most reptiles do, or a lot of reptiles do, but it does show you a type of easy texturing that you can create a very realistic skin-like look. Then down here we have, in this particular sample here, this is scale that you would find a reptile or a fish. And I can show you they're very easy to make as well. In the center is the fur that we work on, different types of fur techniques that you can use. And finally over here, which is a little bit like a combination of the scale, the fish scale I'll call it, and the fur, that feathering actually kind of incorporates techniques of both of these. So let me get started and show you how that's done. First of all, there are a lot of tools on the market, and the type of tool that you would be using to create this are two primary tools. The first tool would be a wire type tool. Now this is a tool that is purchased from a number of the companies that you'll find that sell sculpting tools. Even though I purchased it, to tell you the truth, I hardly ever use it, except in very large early stage pieces where I'm just trying to remove clay. But what I did over the years is that I decided that most of those tools were very ineffective to get the results I wanted. So I decided to make my own tools. And what you can see in this spread of tools here, and I'll show them some of them more closely, these are wire tools that I've created. Here's the larger style that I've created. You can see there's kind of a loop on the one end and a kind of stylized loop on the other end for specific type of carving away large sections of clay in large pieces. Again, here's another larger hoop type or loop type of wiring on either end. The wire on this is the gauge is a little bit less than what you see in this larger tool, as you can see. So there are actually a number of gauges of wire that you can choose to make your tools with. Again, very similar tool with minor variations on it. You can see that up there. See if I've ever been working on it. It's got a clay still on it. And those are the larger ones. Then I have ones where you can see it's a much more sharp point, and a variation of a hooping tool. Now you can see where the one that I purchased has a very, very heavy gauge, and this is a very similar style because it's got that pointed end, but you can take a look and you can see that the wire that I use is a much thinner, which means you can get a much more crisp cut from the clay than this piece. And then also the triangle edge that I have is a much sharper point than what I have on the tool that I purchased here, which is much more rounded. So it's just not as effective as the tools that I make. Then when I get down to final real fine detail, like we'll be talking about today with the fur, the scales, and the feathering, what I do is I make smaller wire tools like this, as you can see, and different variations. You can see this one's much more pointed. The wire is a smaller gauge, and on this end I have a hoop or loop type tool, you could say. And then there's a lot of variations I do on that theme. Sometimes I use the metal, which I'll be talking about in a video that we'll be producing, that shows you how to make all of these tools. And the big advantage, you can say, well, why do I want to make those tools when I can just buy them? Well, If you looked at the prices on a lot of these sculpture websites that are selling tools, you'll find that a tool like this is very, very expensive. And as you can see, I have a whole extent of perhaps 100 different tools. And of these type of wire tools, which I use all the time, I probably have 50. And if you multiply that by the cost of just one of these from a website, you'll see that it gets very, very costly. These tools are relatively inexpensive to produce. I can tell you that the wire that I use is a much stronger wire. They're easy to access all of these materials. The handle part is, as you can see, it's kind of telescoped, but these are brass rods that I use. And these tools last a very long time because of the materials I'm using are very durable. So let me just show you, this is my actually preferred tool for doing this type of work here. The pointed end you can see here is very sharp. So let me set that aside for a second, and because that's the one that I'll do a lot of the finishing work with. The other tool that we'll be using is a brush, and I don't make the brushes, so you can purchase a brush that you like that works great for your techniques. The tool that I usually start with is a tool like this. It's got a little bit heavier gauge than this tool. And what I do first is that and I'll show you on the scale here, what I do is I map out little areas. Make sure you can see that, like that. Now, when it comes to, if you ask what type of clay I'm going to use here, whether it's hard or soft, it really doesn't matter for this type of work where I'm just doing a sampling. The harder the clay is, which is usually what I use when I'm actually doing the final detail, because that's my final larger work, I use the Chavant hard is what I use. The reason is that when you use these tools, you'll get a much more crisp edge and detail in your work. So what we do is we just, like I showed you, I start to map out that little detail here, which is just kind of a little curve here. And then I do a second one underneath that, and then a third. And then what I do is, I have a little piece of clay down here to get the clay off my tool. What I do is I just cut down underneath that to give the feeling of it being lifted out of the clay. Again, just scoop that out like that. And again, scoop it out like that. And the easy thing to remember how to do scales, if you're going to do a reptile or even some birds, what you'll find is where they have scaling on their skin, that scaling tends to overlap the way roof tiles do. So the upper ones overlap the lower ones. And if you can remember that, it makes it easy while you're doing this process. And then I just want to carve that out. So if you want to get a good idea of how that works, just go out and take a look at a roof, try to get a close look at it, and you can see the way that the upper scale or shingle overlaps the lower one, because that's exactly the way we're going to do it here. With a reptile or a bird, the thing is that the scale is obviously going to vary. It might start off in one area of the animal's body where the scale is very small, and then it progresses to a larger size scale. So those are the kind of things you're going to have to look at, study very closely. Once again, go to the internet, look up scales, reptile scales, and you'll see a whole variety of pictures of those. And then you can start to get a better idea of how to reproduce those. All right, so you can see what I've done here. Now, in the final stage, when you've got the detail that you like a lot, what you do is you take your brush and you can have your solvent, and then you can brush over these to get rid of a lot of the anomalies. Okay? Now, when we're going to move over to the fur and the feathers, I do the same basically technique. I use, in this case, Fur does overlap. It tends to break in areas where you can see it, where there's muscle underneath that raises up from an area below. So that's where you'll see these extra delineations in the fur. I think a lot of times in a sculpture, less is more with fur in particular. And that holds somewhat true with feathers as well. The more detail that you put into a feather, and you create a lot of little shadows, it'll tend to mask your geometry a little more than you want it to. So when you're doing your sculpture with that detail of fur or feathers, keep that in mind. Less is probably more. The result will be better. You can always go through the process in the clay to see how you like it with the extra detail, and then if you don't at the end, you can simply take and brush it out. Now I'm going to show you how I do this in the fur. What I do is take that pointed end and I just kind of do little cutouts of the clay. Like that. I hope you can see that very well. Remove that excess clay. And you see, in the sense of the overlapping of the scale here, the way I told you, like a roof shingle, that's the way the fur does it on the bottom. So what you'll have to do is study the animal's body, see the way the fur flows on the body. So, and that's what you're going to do. It generally, and this is not always true, but generally, say if you start with the neck and work down the body, the hair is going to flow from the head area down towards the tail. Okay, so here we are just carving that out a little bit like that, creating that little bit of effect. And then what I do, set this one aside, that's when I come in with the fine finishing, or at least the finer detail in the fur, and I do smaller, and I almost use it like a brush, smaller strokes, more of them, and create that feeling of the fur. And you can see it's almost like brush strokes that I'm using, very similar. And I'm taking off just small amounts of the clay, and I go back and forth, sweep it up, and then cut down, remove from below. And what you can see here is that in the area here where there's excuse me, smoothness underneath the textured fur up here, you can see that the smoothness enhances the detail. The contrast due to the light brings out the fur, the cuts of the fur up here. So a lot of times, that's what I'm saying, you don't need to have a lot of detail, you just need to have those generalized forms in a mammal on its fur to give you that sense of the fur. Now at the end, what you can do, you'll notice that when you're working, you'll notice that you have a lot of little crumbs. That's where you want to use your brush towards the end, and you can just smooth out and brush with brushing strokes over those details that you just produced. And I'll do some up here, and you can smooth it out, covering up some of that, but you'll still get a little bit of geometry showing in there from your cuts that'll give you different results. And I really recommend practice sculpting. Don't always feel that every time you sit down with your clay that you have to produce a finished product. You need to explore. You need to explore what textures and what techniques work best for you. So you could always just set up little pieces like this and just practice rather than to put it on a sculpture in its final stages and have that maybe frustration of discovering that you've put on different types of textures that you really didn't like. So this will help you alleviate that end time frustration when you're trying to complete your sculpture. So as you can see, I'll hold this up to the light. I hope you can see the difference here. Here's where it's a little rougher. I haven't really brushed it that much. And then down here you can see where I've started to brush. And you can see the nice feeling that you get when you brush and remove some of that detail, but you leave a lot of the just very subtle geometry that's in there. And it's picked up with the light, and it creates that fur technique or fur feeling. Okay, now when we get to the feathers and birds, like I said, it's very, very similar to the scales crossed with a fur. And what you have is although birds do have a very established pattern that the feathers follow on the body, they tend to form in groupings that doesn't follow the very, very consistent scale texture or scale pattern that you see in reptiles and even some birds' legs. And primarily we're talking about fish and reptiles here. In the situation with the bird, you create the feathers very similar to the way you create the scales, which is that once again, starting with the head and the neck, the feathers overlap just like a roof shingle from the upper part of the body down all the way to the tail feathers. So what I'm going to do here, you can see I've produced different stages of this here. Up here I put a lot of detail. Down here I'm mapping out where I'm going to have the feathers. And I'm going to show you again, we'll use the same tool and we cut in like so and scoop this out to bring that feather out from the rest of the clay. Again, we make another feather here. Scoop out an area like that. You can see how much I've taken off. A lot of subtractive work is going on here. You remember we talked about the subtractive and additive. And once again, in this stage, if you find you've taken out too much clay and you don't like the result that you're getting, put a little back on. You don't have to put on the whole area, but just the area that you're not as happy with. And we smooth that out, delineating that basic geometric form underneath first. Okay, smooth it with our finger, or we could smooth it with the brush at this stage if we wanted to. What I don't recommend is at this stage you can brush it a dry brush if you want to remove some of the detail. I don't recommend using an oil or any type of solvent at this stage, because what it tends to do is soften and gunk up your clay, and so that when you start doing detail again, you have a different consistency in the clay, and that will definitely affect the outcome of what you're trying to do. So try to do most of your work without any solvent until the very end, and that's something, and once again, when you're in this stage of practice, try your solvents or whatever, whether it's water or a commercially purchased solvent for clay, or Vaseline, whatever. A lot of people use a lot of different things, but try that technique on a sample before you actually do it with your final sculpture. All right, so now, as you can see, I've created these new feathers here. I showed you how to do that, and once again we go back to that fine tool I used to create the feathers, and this is where it's very similar to fur. What we're going to do is we're going to do fine little lines. Now, with a feather as opposed to the fur, is that these lines, they follow a set pattern, these little lines. So they're parallel. There's a central line in their central quill, you might say, in the feather shaft. All right, and so you establish where that would be on the feather. And if you look closely, it's going to be right in the center of that form. Okay, so like so, you establish that center line. Now on smaller feathers, all you have to do is really establish the center line like that. In a larger feather where you're seeing greater detail, then you actually have to establish a shaft that comes down on the feather like that, and it tapers to a point that just disappears into the feather. I hope you can see that. I'll get some of those crumbs off there. And then when you produce or create the rest of the texture, you just do these little fine parallel lines from the shaft to the edge end of the feather, like that. Once again, on this side like that. I'm doing this upside down, so it's a little bit cruder work than I would normally do, but this helps you to see the technique. Okay, and once again, I'm going to create those parallel lines that fan out and then down towards the end of the feather, like so. Okay, all right, and I'll finish this one off here. Just do really quickly here, cutting that like so. All right, get some of that clay off, and here we go. Soften them. They've got to be parallel. If they're not parallel, the feather won't look good. And if you take a look at a lot of sculptures where people have produced eagles or whatever, you'll notice that one of the major flaws in that design is the rough, crude feather technique that they use. So study that when you get a chance, if you go to a gallery where they have some eagle or some other type of bird, and take a look at the different techniques that different artists have used to achieve that beautiful feather effect that a lot are able to do. Again, I'm going to do this one last feather here, radiating from a center shaft, cutting outwards to the edge on here, like so. And then what you can do at this stage is you take, again, your brush, just like you did with the fur. You're going to take and do the same thing with the feather, and you just smooth that out like so. Okay, blend that in. And I'm not using, like I said, this is a dry brush. You have to clean some of your clay off there, but it's going to stick on the brush, so you can expect it. Brush it out away from the central shaft, just the way you tooled the detail out from the center shaft to the outer part of the edge. That's what you do with your brush. Okay, so you can see that the technique there. Now, the other thing is you can do is when you are near the end here, after you brush it, maybe you want to create a little more dimension. Maybe some of the excuse me, some of the feathers that you're looking at on a bird's, whether it's a picture, obviously a model is always much better to use to study. But what you see sometimes is that the bird's feather has splits in the feather like this. Splits in that pattern. You won't see that in a fish scale, but you will see that in a feather. And you just make those extra deep cuts like that. Move that little bit of clay out of the way. Like that. And then once again go back over, brush it, and you can see how that creates areas where the detail has been subdued from the metal tools, but you have a faint sign of those of the detail of those lines and strokes that you put into the feather. So I hope you can see that all right. So there we have these three. Now when you come to this, that's like the scale and the reptiles, as I said, the fur and the feather in the birds. Now when you come to an animal like say a tortoise or a rhino or even an elephant, where they have a very leathery, heavy skin, what you can do is several things. First of all, to create the wrinkle in the skin, you can just take a little piece of your clay. This is going to be an additive stage we're doing. You just take a little snippet here, a little snake-like piece of clay, and you just lay it on the area, and say this is like the neck of a tortoise. Then what you do is you take one of your tools that you can blend that into place like so, and you can see here I'm blending that in on both sides. Alright, this is the upper part, and then underneath I'll just blend it a little less to create a fold that's maybe hanging downwards towards the ground. It's got a little gravity pulling on it, like that. And I'll smooth it first with my finger. Like I said, your hands are always the best tools, like so. Then I come in once again with my fine wire tool, and I just make little lines. I kind of paint them over almost, taking little amounts, going back and forth, doing a lot of this kind of detail. It's really simple and fast. Some are deeper than others. Just back and forth, kind of crisscross pattern, like so. Okay, there we go, like that. And you can just experiment with this. You can get a really good effect on this. Some are going to go this way, the way I'm flowing. Others are going to cross across this way. Just a lot of different strokes you can try to get the effect that you want on the particular species of animal that you're working on. And then, once again, take your brush and gently brush it over. Now this is one area in particular where I've noticed and I've experienced that if you use a solvent at the very end of your sculpture, say it's a dinosaur skin or a turtle skin or a rhino skin, then you just want to go over it nicely and gently with that solvent. And then let it dry for a while and take another look at it. You might want to, after the solvent dries so the clay is not mushy in any way, then you could actually try some more detail that you can put in there. This is a really easy technique which produces a really great result. All of these others are a little bit more difficult, but once you start to practice a little bit, they're really pretty simple. The only difference is that these take a little bit more time than like a reptile's skin. But the results that you'll get from practicing these, I think you'll be very satisfied with. Once again, it's important to have the right tools, and in an upcoming video, I'm going to show you all the different tools I use and how to make those tools and to save yourself a lot of money. That will be on learnsculpture.org as usual, and I hope you will take a look at that. And also, once again, thanks to the person who emailed me with a suggestion of showing them how to do fur. I hope I've answered your question, and if you have any more, just send your questions to me at learnsculpture.org. Have a great day.